Hello viewers, in this video I'm going to try and talk about the trigger job I did on my CZ75. This is a pre-B pistol that you saw in a couple of previous videos. I've gone to the range with this pistol twice. I really didn't like the trigger. There was something wrong with it. I wasn't just complaining. I'll explain in a little bit why I'm saying this. The trigger feels pretty gritty and very gritty on the way out. There's a stop right there. Again, watch all these steps. You see that? So I already did a trigger job on this pistol, but I didn't film it. I tried. It didn't work out. I kind of dropped it, got a little bit upset at myself because basically it was a lighting issue. The footage just wasn't coming out right. Now I got some additional lighting, and even though I already did this trigger job, I decided I'm going to try and do my best and explain what I did. The reason you see these parts in front of you, and we're gonna add a couple of springs here, is that this is what I touched, worked on, and or used when doing the trigger job. I'm using a Cajun Gunworks reduced power trigger return spring, and I'm using their 15-pound hammer spring, which still has a little bit of that gold paint on it. What I did was I sanded, or I guess stoned, the ends of the spring to be flat. There you go. So I did that on both ends. Now let's talk about how this action works. We have the sear cage, the trigger bow, and the disconnector. The disconnector engages the trigger bar in this fashion with its shoulders against these very, very low ledges you see. So that's our double action connection with the hammer. This combination of parts rides under the sear cage. Something like that is how these parts come together. For now, sear cage, just imagine that it's on top of this. Disconnector is pressed up against those ledges of the trigger bar. As the trigger bar pushes the disconnector back, it cocks the hammer. So what lets off the double action trigger pull? The sear cage, as you can hopefully see, has these little ramps. Let me zoom you in a little bit. These two little ramps right here, one right here and one right there, and the corresponding trigger bar ramps, one right here and one right there. You can see they're angled. Hopefully you should be able to see that. So as you pull the trigger to the rear, those ramps push it down, and essentially it happens right about here where you start to catch the sear. So as the trigger bar gets pulled down by those ramps and it lowers, because these ledges are so shallow, when it lowers, it eventually escapes from in front of these shoulders of the disconnector, and the trigger bar drops below the disconnector. And that's what allows the hammer to move forward under the spring pressure of the main spring that sits on the strut right here. So then the gun fires, and remember, we're still kind of holding on to the sear here, even though we pulled in double action, right? We caught the sear. So then the gun fires. Slide has little notches cut for these arms of the trigger bar, so that the trigger bar can move in those notches, I guess, in the slide. You'll see them when you look at your slide. So when the gun fires, the slide recoils back. It pushes the trigger bar even lower, and that's what forces it off of the sear. So that happens. Now the sear is free, so our hammer that gets cocked by the slide remains cocked by now the sear over here in the sear cage. There's our sear. And at this position, our trigger bar sits under the sear and under the disconnector. When you reset the system, remember our hammer is cocked and held by the sear, and our trigger bar was under the disconnector and under the sear. So at some point it needs to get in front of the sear, which will happen somewhere in the middle here. Basically, that's going to be the position. And that's why by the time you push the sear, it'll be before you reach these shoulders. So single action is always, I guess, the hammer is always farther back in single action than in double action. So when you reset, it'll be when the trigger bar, which slides under the sear, will snap in front of it. That's going to be your reset. So it'll be pushed out and then snap, and that's your reset. How far your trigger will travel, possibly outward, is controlled by the back surface of the disconnector, because that's how far your trigger can go forward. You see that? Then you'll start pulling the trigger and turning the sear, and that will free the hammer, and the hammer will fly forward. And that's how this action works, as far as I understand. And now I'll show you pictures of all of the parts I touched, starting with the frame. We'll go over these pictures one by one, and I'll show you all of the areas where I had to stone or sand surfaces down to make them smooth. Here you can see where the disconnector, or the bottom of the disconnector hook, was rubbing on the frame that had very deep machining marks. Here's the very bottom that the disconnector bottom hook, end of the hook rides on. You can see it got a lot smoother. I stoned it down. I didn't want to remove too much material, so there's still some machining marks left, but it's much better than before. And the path of the disconnector doesn't intersect as many of those machining marks. This step on the side of the frame, on the right side of the frame, was left over in machining, and I believe this was the biggest offender during the trigger pull, because the trigger bar had to overcome this little step. You see I filed off that step. Its bottom was right here, and its front face was right here. So that's where that was. I filed it down flat. See, it's not there anymore. So that greatly improved the trigger pull, as in there was no wall anymore. On the left side of the frame you can see something that looks like galling that was left over probably after machining. Those were protrusions, and the trigger bar was rubbing very hard on those as well. I stoned those gall marks, and you actually see how much different machining kind of depths there were when this frame was made and machined on this side. You can see that, hopefully.
Here's how the sides of the trigger bar looked after light stoning. You can see very deep machining marks left over.
Here's the trigger bar. You can see I didn't remove too much. There's still some machining marks, but I did smooth it down a little bit. Those vertical scratches, I didn't do that. I think it's the same as these ones. I think the factory did that. You see these? It's like they just removed some burrs or something with, it looks like grinding. So, grind marks. They're the same on this side. So you see the machining marks still there. I blued the parts, cold blue, slightly. So, but you can see the sides are slightly better than before.
Here are the engagement surfaces of the trigger bar. You can see that they're very rough. There's a lot of machining marks left, and you can imagine how the trigger pull would be rough and the reset would be rough because of how I explained the parts interact with each other.
Here's the result of stoning and bluing on the trigger bar. You can see I tried to smooth down the surfaces that the sear cage rides on. You can see those marks left by it. It looks like we're getting a slightly uneven contact, so I may spend a little bit more time looking at it. You can see those scratch marks are not even on both sides, so that's that. But I also smoothed out the surfaces that the disconnector rides on. So these surfaces during reset, so my reset is not as bumpy as it was before. I tried to stone the flats here a little bit better, and I did a little bit better than they were before, but I couldn't really. It's a really uncomfortable area, so I didn't get too much done in those spots, but it's still better than before.
Even the bottom of the trigger bar, where the channels for the trigger bar spring are cut, you can see the machining marks on those, and during a reset you could feel them as steps.
I took a very small round diamond file down to these channels, and I smoothed them out a little bit so they're not as steppy, so that on reset the trigger doesn't feel as steppy as well, and on trigger pull as well. It just feels a little bit better. So did that.
Here you can see the marks left by the top of the disconnector hook, and you can see the rough machining as well.
Here's how the bottom of the sear cage looks now. You can see the mark left by the top of the disconnector arm, I guess, or hook. The camera is adjusting light. And you can see those surfaces are much smoother, those two pads, one right here and one right here. Those are smoother too. What I should have done was radius the, oh, I did, I radiused the fronts slightly. There you go. And the one thing that I think I shouldn't have done was to radius these as much as I did. The transition between the ramp, the angled surface, and the flat here. I sanded them down or stoned them to create a round transition. Not sure if I should have done that. I think what it did was made my trigger bar lower later than it used to in the past. So even though the transition is not, it's not a huge difference, but I think it's enough of a difference. So we'll see in a second. When I put it together, you'll see how it all works right now.
In this picture, you can see the engagement surfaces for the double action pull, and you can see that they are not even straight. And here is where during reset you'd probably feel all those gouges.
I smoothed out the fronts here. We're getting more even contact, and then I also smoothed out the bottoms. So you see the contact are straight lines. There are no gouges going crosswise to those lines. So smooth that out. Radiused the bottom of the disconnector hook, and just a little bit more smoothing on top. And that's about it. That's all I did. So now let me show you what the trigger behaves like. Now I've reassembled the gun and I can show you what the trigger feels like. So before, you remember there was a kind of like a wall before the trigger would release. So now, let's see. Oh, and it's unloaded, obviously. I just checked it. So that's the trigger pull now. There's no wall. It actually feels lighter. See that? Single action is pretty, I mean, as short as it was before, but also smoother. Let me cock it real quick. Oop, bumped the camera, sorry. Here's the reset, and we're ready to fire. It just feels so much better now. So, and those steps are not there anymore. See, it comes out smoothly. See that? So all in all, I think this is a success, and can't wait to go out and shoot it again. Thanks for watching.